Welcome to Debates. My name is Jerry Christakos, and I'm acting as your timekeeper today. Today's debate, should the U.S. get out from the United Nations? I will begin by introducing our team captains. On the Yes team, we have Mr. William Jasper from the New American Magazine. Mr. Jasper, please stand and introduce your team, please.
On my right here is John F. McManus, president of the John Birch Society. And on the end here, Ken Snyder, executive director of the Liberty Committee.
Very good. An opening statement, if you will.
Yes. The question before us today, should the United States get out of the United Nations? We answer with a resounding affirmative. Founded amid high-flown rhetoric about peace and security, the United Nations has transformed into a hideous monstrosity that instead promotes war, instability, injustice, debt, impoverishment, terror, and tyranny. In recent months, the UN has taken alarming strides to grasp vast new powers to legislate, regulate, tax, police, and judge the peoples and nations of the world, including the people of the United States. The UN and its ardent advocates in the US are pressing furiously to empower the UN with vast legislative, executive, and judicial powers. James Madison, the father of our Constitution, denounced this centralization of power as the very definition of tyranny. The stark choice before us is this: the principles enshrined in our Declaration of Independence and the extensive checks and balances and limitations on government power in our Constitution have allowed us to enjoy the blessings of liberty above all peoples of the earth. The UN, by contrast, is being transformed before our eyes into a de facto world government without constitutional limit.
Can you conclude your statement?
The choice then is obvious. We must either choose between liberty under our Constitution of limited government or the UN's evolving global tyranny. We must choose the former. We must get out of the United Nations and withdraw our political and financial support.
Thank you very much. The team captain for the No team, Mr. Shashi Tharoor, Under Secretary General of the United Nations. Mr. Tharoor.
I'm joined by Bill Vanden Heuvel, who's a former American ambassador to the United Nations, and Bill Lewis, also former ambassador and president of the United Nations Association of the U.S. Well, I think that the proposition is a pretty bad idea, but without getting into the details of what Mr. Jasper said, let me give you 4 practical reasons why, in fact, it's a bad idea. First of all, the United States practically helped create the United Nations. It led the drive to create the United Nations in the midst of World War II, because the American statesmen of the time realized that the absence of a world organization had dragged the United States into 2 world wars in the last century that had cost thousands of American lives. Never again, the US vowed, and indeed the UN worked because it helped contain the tensions of the Cold War and ensured there was no World War III. Second, the problems of our new millennium are problems that the Secretary General Kofi Annan likes to call problems without passports, problems of the environment, of terrorism, of drug trafficking, of international crime, the kinds of problems, AIDS indeed, world war diseases that cross frontiers, the kinds of problems that no one country, however powerful, can solve on its own. And these are problems that the US needs to work with other countries to solve, and the UN helps them do precisely that. Third, burden sharing.
Briefly, please.
Yes, indeed. Well, burden sharing. Essentially, the US has lots of responsibilities around the world. The UN helps them fulfill those responsibilities with other countries. And fourth, simply the cost. The US taxpayer pays less than $1 a year per American for the entire regular budget of the United Nations, whereas the presence of the United Nations in the US contributes $3.2 billion to the US economy. It's a good deal, and public opinion polls show that Americans understand and value that good deal. There's over 80% support in every poll in this country for the UN in the US. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, we'll begin the debate. Should the U.S. get out from the United Nations? We'll begin questioning of each debater by the opposite team. And we will start with Mr. Jasper. Please stand. And questions from the panel, please.
Why do you agree with the Joint Chiefs of Staff that Pakistan is an essential ally in the war against terrorism?
We have various allies around the world in various capacities.
I was just asking, do you agree with the Joint Chiefs of Staff that Pakistan is an essential ally in our war against terrorism?
Not necessarily. Pakistan is a very questionable ally. Pakistan has been allied with some of the most tyrannical regimes around the world, and is allied with some of those which are currently our enemies. The Joint Chiefs of Staff are reflecting a political choice at this point. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have come forward in the last several years and in just the past few months speaking before the House Armed Services, Senate Armed Services Committee, pointing out that this current United Nations peacekeeping operation and others throughout the world are depleting our own military capability to defend our own country, to enable us to carry out what our military is supposed to do. And that is the real danger.
Did you oppose President Bush going to the United Nations and asking for the resolution after September 11th that allowed an international cooperation against it?
Resolution 1373, which he proposed at the United Nations, yes, is precisely what is wrong with the very fundamental aspect of the United Nations. And the United States going to an international body like the United Nations composed of terrorists, tyrants, thugs, and thieves, many of whom are supporting the various
Why did the President do that?
That's a very good question we need to place. We have been placing this to the President. Why should we, the United States, subject our country, so we're a sovereign nation, why do we need permission from the United Nations to take any action which is in our national interest?
It wasn't permission. He was asking in that resolution for the rest of the world to recognize with us the war against terrorism and understanding that we had to act together to defeat terrorism.
And
he wasn't asking for permission to defend
stated
ourselves.
that it imposed obligations upon us and all the nations of the world. And this
To
is
fight
the problem.
terrorism.
This is in any venue to impose obligations upon the United States. The President does not have that constitutional power to impose those kinds of obligations upon us. The President and his office are agents of the principle, the Constitution of the United States. He cannot assume powers.
The principal issue here is, as Bill said, that resolution placed obligations on every nation of the world to fight with us. We already had our commitment. We wanted to get other nations to commit to this same struggle, and they did it.
It imposed obligations upon us all, and that is in every one of the United Nations regimes, whether it's in terrorism, or it's on regulatory on the environment, or whether it's so-called human rights obligations. Those are imposing extra constitutional burdens upon the United States, which the President and even the Senate do not have the authority to impose.
How would you have pursued the President's task of getting all the nations of the world to assist us in our task, since it's not a military problem?
That presupposes that all of the nations of the world are required and that all of the nations of the world are capable. What we see in the United Nations, however, is that some of the worst criminal and terrorist regimes, in fact, some of the very ones whom he named as axis of evil, are members in good standing, have diplomatic immunity, their intelligence services operate on our territory in the United States, out of the United Nations. It is ludicrous to even attempt to...
But those countries wouldn't go away if the United Nations didn't have them as members. They would still be there, and probably
they would not have
difficult
sanctuary within our own borders, and the dignity of office at the United Nations, a rostrum to put forward their propaganda at taxpayers' expense. It was mentioned here, this is a bargain for the United States. When taxpayers are asked specifics about how American taxpayer dollars are spent on specific United Nations programs, they are very emphatic that they are opposed to this.
Don't you realize that it was precisely Hitler's pulling Germany out of the League of Nations that made World War II inevitable? Wouldn't you rather have a rogue state, if that's what you're concerned about, within a framework where they can be accountable, where you can talk to them, where you can engage them in a framework, rather than see what happened when World War II broke out?
The so-called rogue nations are the rule rather than the exception at the United Nations. And we have given them all not only a rostrum from which to use for propaganda, but we've actually given them espionage and terrorist and intelligence operations free and clear here in the United States through diplomatic immunity.
You're saying that the FBI has totally failed in controlling of that?
The FBI has not even been allowed to fully go after this.
All right,
And
I'm sorry, we'll have to
true,
move along.
Mr.
Thank you
Jasper.
very much. All right, we'll take Mr. Tharoor, please stand, and we'll take questions from the panel, please.
Mr. Tharoor, the United States is built on the Declaration of Independence, which says rights come from God and governments should therefore be limited to protecting those rights. The United Nations says rights come from law, and the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights says that exercise of law has to be in conformity with the United Nations Charter. The 1966 International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights says that you have this right except if we pass a law that says you don't. The United States is different. We must remain a sovereign nation. That is one of our reasons why we want to get out of the United Nations, and I think it's as fundamental as you could possibly be. I'd like your response to that.
Well, in fact, every member of the United Nations is extremely strongly and jealously wedded to its sovereignty. In fact, a vast majority of the members of the United Nations fought for and won their sovereignty a lot more recently than you did. And therefore, their sense of the vulnerability of their sovereignty, and I'm referring here to the former colonized countries, is even greater than yours. They're extremely sensitive about any organization that would try and interfere with their sovereignty.
You're talking about countries. I'm talking about the fundamental premise of the United Nations.
The fundamental premise of the United Nations is it's a body of collective cooperation by sovereign member states. Every state maintains its sovereignty, does not relinquish it, but uses its sovereignty to pursue its own sovereign ends in collaboration with others. In the world in which we live, you can't do any of these things on your own. You have to work with people. You couldn't even fly internationally without an international body to make that happen. You couldn't switch on your television set if you didn't have a UN regime that ensured that every country didn't broadcast on everybody else's airwaves. All we're talking about is
international relations not take place before there was a United Nations? Did our founding fathers not in 1794 establish their own bilateral relations and multilateral relations as well? We have never been a totally isolationist country.
Just common sense, Mr. Jasper. Would you rather not have, if you have to talk to 189 people, would you rather not meet them in one place in one room than make 189 trips to different capitals?
That's what the UN makes it possible. You don't usually have to talk to everyone. But go back, Boutros Ghali, recent Secretary General. He said, the time of absolute and exclusive sovereignty, however, has passed. Its theory was never matched by reality. Kofi Annan says, state sovereignty in its most basic sense is being redefined. You're talking about sovereignty one way, but the Secretary Generals of the United Nations are talking about it, abolish it.
We're saying exactly the same. No one is going to abolish sovereignty.
They said that.
Yes, what they're saying is in the world in which we live, it is impossible for any country to conduct itself in total isolation from everyone else. The clothes you're wearing, I bet,
we don't have to have the United Nations.
We
don't have to have the United Nations to be involved with other nations. We have an ambassador in every capital city of the world.
Exactly. And you have an ambassador in every country because you are representing your interest vis-a-vis that one country.
No, to solve a problem.
Where do you represent your interest with every country in the world? See, where do you deal with problems that affect every country in the world?
Well, your attitude would bring the problem to 189 other nations, and I say if you got a problem, solve it one-on-one and don't involve everybody else.
If every problem in the world could be solved one-on-one, you'd be absolutely right. That isn't the world in which we live.
Yes, it is.
Many of the problems we have begin in more than one country and end up in more than one country. Do you think terrorism is a problem you can solve one-on-one? Terrorism doesn't originate in any one country. The victims are not from any one country. The terrorists themselves are not from any one country, and they don't have sanctuary in any one country. You're going to have to deal with that by dealing with a heck of a lot of countries.
Mr. Thoreau, the United Nations proponents speak often about democracy and majority rule. Recently, as you know, the International Criminal Court was ratified and is now in existence. There's 191 countries in the world, and it only took 66 of those countries, or 35%. 16% of the world's population voted for the ICC. That doesn't sound like majority rule to me.
The ways in which any of these treaties work is, in fact, prescribed by international legal norms. There are treaties that the U.S. has signed and ratified. There are treaties the U.S. has not signed and not ratified, or indeed some that it's signed and not yet ratified. So you've got the whole range. I myself come from a country, India, which has not signed the International Criminal Court. But the point is, whenever a collection of countries signs a treaty, they make the rules under which that treaty is to be implemented. In this particular instance, the ICC will not be a United Nations body. It will be a body independent of the United Nations, to which the members who have ratified it will in fact make the rules, and they will run the organization. So I'm afraid you can't entirely blame the United Nations for every treaty. We provide forums at which treaties can be discussed, and we believe that's a very important function of the UN. But in fact, when the treaties are done, it's sovereign member states exercising their sovereign right to conclude a treaty freely, and the U.S. used to conclude treaties way before the UN ever existed. It's the same thing.
All right, thank you, Mr. Thoreau.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. McManus, please stand, and we'll take questions again from the panel.
As Mr. Thoreau said at the beginning, 70 to 80% of the American people support the United Nations. They think it's a good idea. They're behind it. And in fact, you find a larger percentage of the American people behind it than you do congressmen. Now, the question I always used to ask my Soviet counterparts when I was a Cold Warrior fighting the Cold War for the United States was, do you really believe this rubbish? When I'd ask them about communism, do you believe communism is really going to take over the world? Do you believe you're going to end up with no currency? And I guess I have to ask you, I want to know if you really believe what you're saying. In this world where we're all ever more connected, do you really think we should disengage from the only universal organization that allows us to communicate, as Mr. Thoreau was saying?
The answer to that is absolutely yes.
You do?
I do. I do indeed. I believe that the United States is different, that rights come from God and governments should be limited. That's our fundamental premise. And no other country said there's no God at the United Nations. They don't recognize that rights come from God. They presume to grant rights, and then they qualify them out in the very act of the granting. Read the international covenants on civil and political rights. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of religion except if we pass a law that says you don't. And on they go.
Do you know how
I don't
these
want to have
began?
anything to do with that, and I don't think the American people would want to have anything to do with that if they knew what we know about the United Nations, and believe me, we're reaching a lot of people.
You meaning?
The John Birch Society.
Yeah. I just don't know how, given the world today and how much it's changed, even since we were founded as a nation, or since the Second World War when the UN was founded, how you plan to conduct in this very complex world of 190 nations, of so many different languages and so many cross-territorial threats to our security. How do you plan to manage that if we're not involved except with a few countries bilaterally?
Well, we're involved with every country bilaterally with an ambassador. And the second thing is that the United States should remain strong enough so that nobody will mess with us. And if we do that, then we'll have peace, as far as the United States is concerned. If one country wants to go after another country someplace else in the world, why should it be the United States to get involved?
No nation in the world would challenge us militarily head on. None. That's done. That's history. The only thing we can count on is that there'll be more terrorist acts. 9/11 was not challenging our military. It was challenging us here in our country on our turf. And it was some wacky people who put together a crazy idea that worked, and it killed thousands of people. That's what the future is. The future is made up of individuals, not states, of groups, not nations, who work across borders and function against our interests. The only way we as a nation can manage that is to make sure that other nations working with us keep track of these crazies who want to do us harm. And I tell you, there's no way the American military, and they say it themselves, can solve this problem. It's not, the Secretary of Defense can't solve it. He might be able to kill some members of Al-Qaeda, but to solve the issue worldwide is impossible. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's a question, right?
Yeah, the question is, how do you solve it without everybody else on your team?
You solve it by being so strong that nobody is going to fool around with you. That's very simple.
You were pretty
That's
strong
the
on
history.
that.
That's the history of.
Aren't we the
Human nature
strongest
doesn't
nation?
change.
Aren't we the strongest nation in the world?
Yes, we are the strongest
Is there-
nation in the world, but we use our strength for, I think, for wrong purposes.
What didn't we do in terms of the terrorists?
Well, let's go back a little. Korean War, the United States went to the United Nations for authorization to conduct a war. Vietnam War, we went to CETO, which is a United Nations creation, to
It is
for
not.
authorization.
It is not.
It's not a
It is
UN creation.
absolutely not.
Absolutely. Under Article 51,
It
the
is
regional
absolutely
arrangements,
not.
according to Lyndon Johnson, who was President of the United States at the time, and John Foster Dulles, who helped to set it up.
Absolutely not. The
Well-
Vietnam question never went to the United Nations. It was never involved in any agency of the United Nations. And CETO,
Sir,
and
I wrote
was
a
the
book
assistant
about
to-
it, and I quoted State Department bulletins on that subject.
I was assistant to our ambassador in Thailand.
Well,
at
you
the
missed
time it
out
was
on that
negotiating.
part.
His name was Wild Bill Donovan.
Yeah.
And he knew almost as much as you do about the
Almost.
military needs of America.
You're right
and its
about that,
history.
almost. Right. So we went for authorization. In Desert Storm, we went for authorization to conduct the war.
We went to seek allies.
Well, we went for authorization. That's what Mr. Bush said, the elder Mr. Bush. Bosnia, we went for authorization. Now, again, authorization. My point is very simple.
Just,
One
quickly,
seeks
Mr. McManus,
authorization from a superior, not an inferior. Our country is being delivered to the United Nations. It's not so much that the United Nations is taking us over, but it's people from the Council on Foreign Relations like you gentlemen who are delivering our country to the United Nations.
All right, thank you, Mr. McManus. Let's move quickly. Ambassador Van der Heuvel, please rise, and questions, please, gentlemen.
Mr. Van der Heuvel, it was previously mentioned by Mr. Thoreau that it is the international legal norms which are important in advancing this new rule of law under the United Nations. In our system of government, we are under a constitution. It is our supreme law of the land. When our constitution comes in conflict with so-called legal norms and treaties of the United Nations, how is that resolved in your mind?
The Supreme Court of the United States determines which prevails.
And how has the Supreme Court ruled on this case where the Constitution is in conflict with the legal norms?
I know of no case where any treaty that the United States has ratified has been ruled unconstitutional.
When it has been challenged in terms of legal treaties overriding the Constitution in Joffrey versus Riggs and Reed versus Coder, the Supreme Court has spoken very strongly, saying that
the United States has always been the advocate of the rule of law in the world because we believe that that is an essential basis of democracy.
And what is the rule of law?
The rule of law that we have tried to build in the world is to get the nations of the world to agree to conduct that is acceptable in a civilized world. And that reflection of civilized conduct is reflected often in treaties and other forms of understandings.
And under our Constitution, government is very strictly limited as to what it may do. The legislative, executive, and judicial powers are very strictly limited and defined. At the United Nations, with this proliferation of treaties, charters, commissions, etc., we find in the environmental, in the terrorist realm, many of these areas, a completely open-ended invitation at the United Nations. I've been covering it for many years at many of the summits for empowering the United Nations with legislative, executive, and judicial powers. This was part of the Millennium Summit, the Millennium Declaration, to create a new global assembly, to create this international criminal court.
The Millennium Summit set out for the world goals for the next 15 years that we hope that we could accomplish together to establish a form of governance that would allow us to live in a civilized framework of nations.
And that is a point that I've been trying to get at these
each one of the nations has to voluntarily be part of that, and American leadership is required to accomplish it. And I'm not aware of a single instance in the entire history of the United Nations of you're talking about where there's an encroachment upon the constitutional integrity of the United States.
At these conferences, I've repeatedly asked top members of the U.S. delegations as well as international leaders there, what do you mean by world governance, global governance? It seems to me you're talking about global government. And we get this semantic dodge.
One American representative who told you that?
Yes, Mr. Van der Heuvel. Let me
Is there one American representative who told you that?
Let me follow up on that point, sir.
Yes, let him follow up.
I'll follow up on that point. In October of 1999, Walter Cronkite spoke at the UN and called openly for world government. And the
Walter
end of
Cronkite
national
is a citizen of the United States. He wasn't speaking on behalf of the United States.
Quote, it seems to many of us that if we are, let me tell you what he said. It seems to many of us that if we are to avoid the eventual catastrophic world conflict, we must strengthen the United Nations as a first step toward world government patterned after our own government with a legislature, executive, and judiciary, and police to enforce its international laws and keep the peace. Can you repudiate Mr. Cronkite's advancement for world government?
I don't repudiate him. Mr. Cronkite is an eminent citizen of the United States who has observed the world over a career of 60 years.
Do you agree with his aspirations for the world government vis-a-vis the United Nations?
I don't think that we're going to have, well, what he says is what you deny. The United Nations, he says, is not a world government.
It's a first step toward a world government.
It's a first step to bring about governance in a world that allows nations to live at peace without violence. I can't imagine any citizen of the United States being opposed to that.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. All right. Mr. Snyder, please. Questions?
Mr. Snyder, I'm curious about where all this is going, because it looks like you folks on your side of this debate essentially feel that you can get along without the rest of the world. And that would be great. I must say, I'm not an American. I guess I'm the only non-American here. But it seems to me that if indeed it were possible to say, stop the planet, we want to get off, that would be great. In practice, the problems the U.S. faces, precisely because you are the great country that you are, the hyperpower, as some have called you, means that you will constantly be dealing with issues that go beyond your borders. You have interests around the world. What other forum can you imagine that gives you the international legitimacy to do the kinds of things you need to do away from your borders? Can you work without coalitions? And if you need coalitions, if you need others to work with you, how do you expect to develop those, to achieve them, if you don't have a common framework of understandings, laws, authorities, resolutions, whatever you call them, within which everyone wants to share your ideals? How would you make your ideals as an American palatable to the rest of the world without a common framework within which they would see that your ideals are also in their interest?
Well, if the United Nations was as you described, I would agree with you. The United Nations, when it was formed, 55 or so years ago, was to be a mere debating society. But today it is much, much more than that. Whether it's the World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, now the International Criminal Court, our position is very simple. We are opposed to the United Nations for this very simple reason, and that is what the United Nations has become and what it is going to become, and that is world government. There is absolutely no question in my mind, as well as the proponents such as Walter Cronkite and other people who advance the idea of world government openly talk about it. Several years ago, it used to be people like us would be minimized by saying world government, you're conspiracy, you're freaks, you're on the fringe. But now in publications today, especially overseas press, the idea of world government is advanced. When you have the International Criminal Court, and of course they are going to be scouring the world to adjudicate their first case.
Yeah, well, the court has very precise rules, Mr. Snyder, which say that only those states that have ratified the court, only their nationals, can be brought before the court.
Exactly. Let me explain about the court so everyone understands
but
this.
in any case, that's, as I said, that is not a UN body. Let's talk about the UN
Well, see,
specifically.
this is
what are the elements of a world government? When you have a government, you have authority, which the UN doesn't have. We don't have a standing army. We don't have a standing police force.
But the
we
UN
don't
talks
have the
about
capacity
having
to
a
do
standing
anything.
army, and it has for years. The UN once, in fact, on CNN, just the other day, I was at the airport. I saw a graphic on the screen talking about the United Nations, and they said UN police.
I know, these
What
are
is the
people
UN
lent
police?
to us by member states, and they belong to the member states, and they go back to the member
And
states.
they wear UN uniforms, the UN blue, the UN helmets,
So you
and the
can tell
UN
them
patch.
apart from others, yes, you do need an insignia to keep them safe.
And the United States has asked the United Nations to create those forces in certain specific situations like Bosnia.
Just because the United States does that doesn't mean that we agree with the policy,
No,
because
I mean,
there are
what you're
many
saying
people
is you
within the
don't-
United
you don't
States
agree with
who
President
want
Bush.
world government. In fact, the people, as you mentioned correctly, that the United States was in fact one of the originators of the United Nations. If I were alive then, I would have vehemently disagreed with them at the point, because we understand what is coming, and that is, if you understand the history of humankind, you're going to work towards central government whether you like it or not.
Well, it was
And
the
we're against
isolationists
it.
before World War II, was it not? People like Senator Vandenberg, who, because they understood the history of humankind, changed their minds. Why do you think the Senate ratified the UN Charter 98-2?
The idea that you have to have this regime, as you said earlier in your opening statement, I believe, to interact with the rest of the world is preposterous. We interacted with the rest of the world. The world is becoming complex, as you mentioned. I totally agree with you. And that is the very reason that you cannot have a central management team. There is no way to do so.
It would be impossible.
Markets work, freedom of expression, freedom of interaction works.
Government
It's very hard to
implies a
discuss
certain amount of
these questions
power.
with you because what you're describing is something that none of us know.
Government
You're
implies-
describing an organization that doesn't exist.
It certainly does
Government
exist.
implies power. The United Nations
Yes.
has no power. The only power the United Nations has is that which its member states give to it. And we are the biggest giver of power to the UN. And without us,
We should not.
the United States is nothing.
We should not.
They can't do anything without us. And so what we do is
And
we
I hope
empower
that
them.
is true, because we'd like to see the U.S.
Basically,
withdraw
our
from the
role
UN and
has
to see
been
if
to
the UN
empower
does
the
fold.
UN to enable it to do things that are in our interests. And we've, over and over again, in the case of Korea, in the case of the Gulf War, in the case of fighting AIDS, in the case of eliminating smallpox, we have empowered the UN, and we have helped empower them with other nations to do what's right for the American people. That's what it's all about.
Well, let me say this.
I'm
But
sorry,
they have no
we're
other power.
out of time, unfortunately. Thank you, Mr. Snyder. And now, Mr. Lures, please rise. And questions, gentlemen.
Mr. Lures, you mentioned that it's the fight against terrorism that it behooves us to get in with the United Nations and really work there at the United Nations. But can you really put faith in a United Nations which is composed of some of the very terrorist states and which enthusiastically applauds and welcomes and supports these terrorist states? Iran, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Sudan, China. Castro, Cuba. These are nations which are at enmity with us, which help fund terrorism, which have been funding terrorism against us overseas as well as here at home. It seems to me a very big stretch to insist that these are going to be our hopes for salvation in the fight against terrorism.
It's a good question. It's an important one. This world is made up of good guys and bad guys and a lot of people in between. I don't feel great about many of the countries in the UN. There may be 10 or 12 that really are active, involved in terrorism and rogue states, as you call them. And the fact that they're there doesn't make me love them any more or less. But the fact that they're there gives it an environment in which every nation can talk to them. They want to be there. Every nation in this world wants to be in this body. And that's the first principle of what the UN is all about.
Is that not in principle?
And maybe somehow these nations will learn from their experience and from the pressure that comes on them in that body how to function in the world today. You know, it's easy in a society like ours to have prisons. Bad guys go to prison, you lock them up, you close them down. You can't do that in this world.
But what
you
you're
can't
advocating
put all of China in a prison.
Is that we invite the criminals, the criminal regimes, onto the police department, into the courts, into the prosecutors, into the legislature, and that somehow is going to solve this problem. It seems to me that is so patently, facially ludicrous.
The suggestion I have, and by the way, I disagree with Walter Cronkite. I don't want the UN to become world government. And I don't think there's anybody I know
but you
that
think
works in
they're
the UN.
going to throw you out of the Council on Foreign Relations.
Absolutely, they may.
But
Walter's a free citizen. He's a very good friend of mine, and he says that he's a distinguished citizen. But he thinks something that I don't think.
Mr. Lewis, can I go back? 1962, the United States financed a report. The State Department, led by CFR member Rusk, and the Defense Department, led by CFR member McNamara, a report called A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations. And here are the steps to take to have the United Nations become a world power. It ends at one point by saying,
where is this from?
Finally, to avoid endless euphemism and evasive verbiage, the contemplated regime will be referred to unblushingly as a world government. Lincoln P. Bloomfield, a member of your Council on Foreign Relations, 1962. If you'd like, I'll make sure you get a copy of this.
Sure, but I don't know what that has to do with reality. What does that have to do with you have a paper, like McCarthy used to say, I have a piece of paper in my hand. Who knows what's in that paper? Who knows where it came from?
Well, I just offered you a copy of it.
And who knows what reference it has to anything? We're talking about a world today.
It has plenty of
if
reference.
Lincoln
it was financed by our government.
He probably wrote it how many years ago?
In 1962.
4 years ago.
It's been followed.
I don't really think that even when the United Nations was founded, it was seen as a government in the sense of a government empowered to control the world.
Are you aware who founded the United Nations?
This country, you know what the budget of the UN is? I was president of the Metropolitan Museum for 15 years. Yeah. The budget of the Secretariat here in New York is about the same as the endowment of the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
What's that got to do with the price?
It's so powerless. It has no power. It has no resources.
It's gaining power.
It has power.
Does that budget
it has power on the basis of what countries want to give to it.
Does that budget
we're the
include
principal donor to it?
All of the billions of dollars which the United States takes out of our defense budget on so-called peacekeeping operations in defense of and in furtherance of these United Nations objectives, or the vast billions of dollars that have been put in UN institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and other
the entire budget
international
of all
brief,
UN
please.
agencies
In brief, please.
are 1/100th of the Defense Department budget. If you put all UN agencies together, they only have 1/100th of the only $4 billion.
I'm sorry, gentlemen. We'll have to move along. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Let's quickly go on to the one-on-one questioning segment. One debater from each team will stand face-to-face, and we will direct questions to each other. Now we will hear a question from Mr. Jasper to Mr. Tharoor.
Mr. Tharoor, it was been told me that the United States, American people, I believe you said, support the United Nations by 70 to 80%. However, just a couple of years ago, Mr. Strobe Talbot, Undersecretary of State for the United States, spoke before the United Nations Association said that the support had dropped off dramatically, that the United Nations was in desperate straits, and that it was being repudiated by the American people.
I think there are more recent polls, I'm afraid, that will confirm the figures that Bill Lewis and I have used.
And Mr. Talbot also, in his address to the United Nations Association, continued his previous statement in favor of globalization, in favor of diminishing the United States' sovereignty for world government. It seems to me throughout the past a decade, it has been obvious that the United Nations has been accreting more power. It has been getting more legislative, executive, and judicial power. And the American people have not been totally made aware of that because the transparency is not there. It doesn't seem there's real honesty forthcoming about the objectives of the United Nations.
Believe me, there isn't a more transparent body than the United Nations. We are congenitally incapable of keeping a secret, which is one reason why no one will entrust us with any real power. The fact is quite simply that when you speak in terms of power in these very generalized ways, Mr. Jasper, you don't actually point to any specific examples of that. We have, as I said earlier, and as Bill and the two bills have pointed out, we don't, for example, have a single soldier belonging to the UN. We have to go to member states every time a UN peacekeeping operation is authorized. We don't have a single policeman. We have to go to member states to get them. We don't have any authority over anybody. All we have
and we have been blessed thus far, but in each of those areas that you've just mentioned, the United Nations and various member states are proposing, providing exactly those powers.
Not at all. No, in fact, as I said, we are a body of sovereign member states who jealously guard their own sovereignty. Let me try and explain this to you. When we say the United Nations, we actually mean, if I can borrow a theatrical metaphor, three things. It's a stage, a forum where governments get together and discuss common issues and problems. It's also, in a sense, a director, because the United Nations helps generate ideas and courses of action in resolving some of the specific problems the UN faces. And then it's finally an actor. In the actor role, you have the Secretary General and his staff, the Secretariat, that go out and implement the decisions the UN General Assembly or Security Council has taken. And in all of these three roles, the UN is doing what governments, sovereign governments, want to have done. Because in the world in which we live, governments recognize that they can best pursue many of their interests and ward off many of their problems by acting in concert with others. That's all the UN's trying to do.
All right, and with that now, Mr. Theurer, if you may pose a question.
Yes, I would actually like to ask Mr. Jasper the question implicit in my earlier answer. What attributes of world government do you consciously see? My understanding of a government is something that has executive power over the citizens, that maintains law and order over the citizenry, that usually has a police force to do that, the power to uphold laws, punish violators, have a judicial system that takes people to jail and actually runs the jails that keep them. Which of these attributes has the United Nations acquired?
In all of those areas, the United Nations is right now, as we speak, in the process of acquiring
those. What's evidence for that?
In a couple of weeks, I may be at South Africa at the Johannesburg Earth Summit, where the Earth Charter, the Agenda 21, calls for regulating the activities of every person on Earth. It sets out a very precise regime, meticulous, covering every activity, as it says, of every person on Earth. For regulating really all of the environment, for regulating all of the workplace, the health care, etc. We just had in April a meeting, a summit in Monterrey, Mexico, for global taxation.
No, and there's no global tax. I'm sorry, you can't utter untruths, Mr. Jasper. There was no global tax. This is
precisely so.
There were contributions being made by governments, but not on a tax basis. It was a voluntary contribution. When President Bush pledged $5 billion, it was American money.
That goes on at the United Nations at the ICC Earth Summit, at the various summits around the world, where the United Nations puts forth a regime for some kind of global regulation. And we have the nations of the world, which are there, most of which are subservient to the United Nations. They are under the United Nations for international monetary fund loans, their World Bank loans and everything. Their whole governments are dependent upon the United Nations. There is no longer a question of agent principle in legal terms here, because the United Nations and its subsidiary organizations, IMF, World Bank, and other agencies, the World Health Organization, are those which are really controlling the policies. Many of these countries are actually being put into receivership now under the IMF. This is not a a case of the nations maintaining their sovereignty.
Yeah, the IMF and the World Bank are not part of the United Nations organization proper, but that's again a separate issue which we needn't worry about. Our concern here is with your interpretation of things like the World Summit on Sustainable Development, the meeting in Johannesburg, which is nothing but a forum for governments to get together to discuss how poor countries can develop in a sustainable way, in a way that doesn't destroy the planet for future generations.
Quick response,
Treaties that are called soft law, which develop teeth, as some of your advocates have said over the years, which then compel nations to abide by United Nations treaties, conventions.
How can we compel? In what way can the UN compel anybody?
I'm sorry, gentlemen, we'll have to wait on that. Let's move to our center debaters, please. Please stand. Questions from John McManus, please.
Mr. Vanden Heuvel, United Nations University, April 2000, declared national sovereignty must be terminated. Respecting any nation's right to be independent, said the document, quote, is to be complicit in human rights violations. In 1970, U Thant, Secretary General of the United Nations, wasn't able to attend a symposium on Stalin's partner Lenin in Finland, and so he sent a message. And he said in his message that Lenin's ideals of peace are in line with the aims of the UN Charter. How revealing. Please respond. Do you think that the United Nations Charter and Lenin's ideals are in tandem, as did the Secretary General?
United Nations Charter, the very heart of it, is dedicated to the four freedoms which were announced by President Roosevelt in 1941 as the aims of our country: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. Those are the words in the United Nations Charter.
I don't find them.
That you can't find them? Well, then you've never
They're
read
in the
it.
international.
You have never read it.
I have it right here.
Well, then read the Charter of the United Nations.
What I read here is here where it says
May
that.
I ask you, have you ever read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
I certainly have.
What
That's
do you
the
find out-
document
what do
that
you object
says that
to it?
all rights have to be in conformity with the Charter.
What do you object to in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
That the rights don't come from God. That's what I object to. Rights
Wait a
do
minute,
come
wait a
from
minute.
God.
Do you think the United States Constitution is the fundamental law of the United States?
Yes,
How many times is God mentioned in it?
once.
Never.
Once.
Never.
In the year of our Lord, it says at the end of it. And who do you
There
suppose
is
they
no
were referring
reference.
to when they said the Lord?
The rights of the people of the United States are created from the people.
The philosophical base
by
of our
the people.
country is not the Constitution. The philosophical base is the Declaration. 4 mentions of God. The nuts and bolts to run a country is the Constitution. That's a very important
Your idea
distinction.
of theocracy is closer to the Ayatollah Khomeini's than it is to mine. My idea of America is where each of us have a right to worship as we please.
I don't dispute
And we're
that.
not dictated to by anyone.
I don't dispute
And there's
that.
not a document in the United Nations that disagrees with that. And you know that.
I know that the United Nations does not recognize God.
May I just ask you one question? Yes. In your objection to the peacekeeping of the United Nations, how many missions, peacekeeping missions, are there out there now? Maybe you don't know that. There are 8.
There are quite a few. That's
how many
true.
United States soldiers are involved in them?
Well, the United States soldiers have been pulled back from many of them. I realize
How many
that.
soldiers are in them?
Oh, 5,600 or one United States soldier?
Yeah, according to the New York Times article last week, there is 1 U.S. soldier serving a military role in the peacekeeping missions. There are 33 who serve military observer roles.
And there are 280 million Americans paying for it.
who serve as civilians. Yes, because it's serving our purpose. There's not a single peacekeeping mission that is performed by the United Nations that we don't approve. And if we don't approve, we just veto it.
When you say we, you're
The United
speaking,
States
you're speaking
government.
about the United
Because we're now
I'm
into your
saying the
question.
United States government. The fact that you are at odds with President Reagan and President Bush and President Nixon and every president of the United States in the last 60 years, that's your right as an American citizen.
Well, thank you.
But I think you are, I hope you are, in a desperate minority.
Yes. Another question, Ambassador, please.
How do you feel that, do you think that NATO is a group that the United States should belong to?
NATO is a part of the United Nations, has been right from the start. Dean Acheson said so. It was formed in 1949, said Dean Acheson, Secretary of State of the United States, in order to strengthen the United Nations. I'll send you the documentation on that as well.
You're opposed to NATO?
I'm opposed to the United States tying itself down so that its activity is dictated by others.
Is there any
That's what
international
NATO
treaty
does.
to which we're a party that you favor?
Oh, I think the Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War and things like that, they're fine. Yes.
Why would you agree to them?
Well, because some of them make sense.
Yeah.
it does not make sense for us to turn over our sovereignty to the United Nations, which is what is being done.
You have not given one single instance where the sovereignty of the United States has been violated by the United Nations.
Well,
I mean, if you say that when the United States, through its constitutional processes, agrees to an international treaty and accepts the international obligations, that is the Constitution of the United States allowing us to create international relationships that serve American interests.
Our problem is that our view of the Constitution says they never should have done that in the first place.
But
May I respond to something Mr. Thoreau said?
Yes,
he said
briefly,
that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are not part of the United Nations. This is a chart I picked up at the United Nations, and there's the flow chart, and there's the World Bank, and there's the International Monetary Fund.
To what is called the common system rather than the organization, which is what
why is it on your flow chart if it's not part of the United Nations?
It's a one-on-one. All right, thank you very much, gentlemen. Let's move on to our last pair, and we'll take a question now from Mr. Snyder.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis, I'm encouraged that you don't agree with Mr. Cronkite's opinion or wish that the UN becomes global government. But let me ask you a question. If, in your opinion, your assessment, sometime in the future, if the United Nations really had all of the enforcement of a government, would you be in favor of the United Nations at that time? How would you respond to it?
I can't speak for the next generations who will deal with a world that is becoming ever more complex, where this terrorism takes over from nation states, in which disease and refugees suffer and move beyond borders where they are. How would I predict? At this stage in my life, and as long as I'm around, I doubt very much if I will say the UN, which has been a very effective way to bring nations together to solve mutual problems, should become a government. There's nobody who seems to want it. When the world and the United States decides it should be a government, if that ever happens, maybe it should. But it's not on my screen.
Well, let's talk about a little bit more about the possibility of the United Nations becoming a world government. Of course, the creation of the international...
Why do we talk about this?
Because our contention is it is becoming one, and it will very, very quickly.
But how is it becoming one? That's what we'd love to know.
I'll be happy to talk about that and answer also to these questions from the other panelists about what evidence. The International Criminal Court was created and is in business July the 1st.
Nothing to do with the United Nations.
It had everything to do with the United Nations.
That had nothing to do with the United Nations. It is a non-UN body.
Which makes it even more absurd, because when you take a look at the International Criminal Court Treaty, there's two things. It says that it's going to be separate from the UN, yet it was created by UN activity. Let me finish.
UN was a center where it could be.
And it says that it will later establish some sort of relationship with the United Nations. So in my opinion, the UN has created this supranational or super world government.
Let me tell you, the only connection between the United Nations, two connections between the United Nations and the ICC. One is they offered the means of negotiating it, as treaties often are. People use the UN as a site to do it. And secondly, at our request, at the United States government request, during our negotiation of this treaty, we said we want the Security Council, the UN Security Council, to be able to put off any action by the Inspector General for a year and then extend that under Article 16 of the treaty. And the only time the UN is even brought in is as a venue for negotiation, and through this connection which we offered and it was accepted, that the UN Security Council can basically veto for a year any action.
Why do you believe that President Bush and Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld are so adamantly opposed to the International Criminal Court, as well as many senators and congressmen?
There are some valid concerns about the court. The Soviets and the Indians and the Russians the Russians, the Indians, and the Chinese all have valid concerns about the court.
What are those concerns?
And what they've chosen to do is sit as observers and watch how the court evolves.
And Israel,
this is a theoretical issue. You're talking about a theoretical question.
I'm sorry, gentlemen. We'll have to go on. A question now from Mr. Lewis, if you will.
You impressed me with your reasonableness on a number of issues, and I'm just struck by how you and people you represent think we should deal with this complex world today. I mean, what is a better way than to try to get together to resolve problems with other nations? And what is a better place to do that in the UN? Without the UN, we would not have our annual vaccines for flu. We would not have standard regulations with regard to the flight of aircraft and English language spoken by every pilot. We would not have a vast program to fight AIDS and limit the possibility of Ebola becoming like AIDS. On and on, the issues of our U.S. interests are protected by this. How will we do it?
I used to have the same opinion that you did, quite frankly. But as I said in my remarks earlier, when I realized the United Nations has become, and in my assessment is becoming, much more than what it was touted to be when it was created, more than a debating society. When I look at the International Criminal Court, which is related to the United Nations, and it says that it's going to have jurisdiction over every person on the planet, when I understand that, when I see that, when I read the actual ratification, the ICC treaty, when I see the title to the International Criminal Court Treaty that says statute, that says a statute.
Nothing to do with the United Nations, except the connection.
It has everything to do with the United Nations. Oh, it has everything to do with it. To answer your question directly, complex world, in my opinion and my understanding, is not from central government. If the United Nations does not become a government and is a mere debating society, fine. But in my opinion, that has gone beyond.
It was not founded as a debating society. It was founded to rid the world of the scourge of war. The hope for the UN was that it would make it impossible for the nations to go once again back to battle and kill hundreds of thousands of people around the world. It didn't achieve that. It did not stop war.
Well,
what it has done, and so in fact, its role is very different than it was originally perceived to have. Nobody realized or thought there'd be 190 countries in the world that had to talk to each other, that had to find ways to communicate, that had to find ways to find mutual solution to problems. Well, and what it's become is not just a debating society, it's become a communal method by which people can work together.
But see,
and that's what America was founded on.
Tyrants in the history of humankind have always touted efficiency. I object to the idea of efficiency when it comes to government.
If you think UN is efficient, you're crazy.
When you study,
all right, with that, gentlemen, I'm afraid
I agree.
I'm afraid we're out of time. We'll have to conclude the debate now, and each team captain will make a closing statement. And the question again: should the U.S. get out from the United Nations? We'll hear from Mr. Tharoor.
Well, I really want to get away from these fantasies of world government into the real world that those of us living in New York experienced just a few months ago on 9/11. Because I think on 9/11, the cliche of the global village really came true. Because we realized when those planes hit those towers that we live in the kind of village in which a fire that starts in a dusty tent half the world away can be strong enough to melt the steel girders that underpin the tallest skyscrapers on this continent on the other side of the globe. And from that realization, I believe, we recognize how much we are interdependent on each other and why we need the United Nations to help solve these problems. The United States cannot deal with all these problems on its own, and indeed, if the UN didn't exist, the US would have to do much more on its own because of flames the UN could no longer douse would lick at the US's doorstep. When I hear these gentlemen here speaking of the US getting out of the UN, I'm reminded of the old story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where Adam finds that Eve is becoming indifferent to him. And Adam says to Eve, "Eve, is there someone else?" You can ask that about the United Nations. Is there anyone else, any other institution that brings the entire world together to work on common problems, to enable humankind to dream the same dreams? The answer is there isn't one. The United Nations is the one indispensable global institution in our increasingly globalizing world. It is not a world government. It helps to serve the interests of its members, including the United States. And the US should therefore not leave, but lead the UN. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. In closing remarks, please, Mr. Jasper.
There is a certain, I'm sure, unintended arrogance in the assertion by many that it is the United Nations which gives the United States and other sovereign nations legitimacy, and that apart from this organization, the United Nations organization, all the world would be at a loss. We would not have any means of getting together and working together without jeopardizing that which is so valuable to each of us. The United States is a separate sovereign nation. We We recognize in our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence a rule of law which is different, many of us believe, better than, certainly better suited to us, than that which prevails in many other parts of the world. We do not believe that should be sacrificed in any way, and in fact, we owe it to ourselves, to our posterity, to those who have gone before us, who have given us all of these blessings of liberty, to preserve that. It is really a choice between whether we will preserve our Constitution, Declaration of Independence, or whether we will live under United Nations Charter and United Nations global law.
All right. Thank you very much, and thank you, gentlemen, you very distinguished panel today. That concludes our debate, and thank you very much for joining us. Please join us, if you will, on our website, www.debatesdebates.org, and please email us with any questions or comments or perhaps topics for future shows. That address again, www.debatesdebates.com.